Yeah, well, thank you very much for having me here and for inviting me to this great conference. So the starting point of this paper is something we all, of course, know and agree on, that where a person lives determines, up to a big extent, his income, productivity, and more generally speaking, that person's well-being. But of course, when people are located in a low productivity place or in an unpleasant location, they will try to move out. But there are restrictions to that, so there's no free mobility. And that raises kind of the issue of how migratory restrictions shape the economic geography, not just in a static sense, but also in a dynamic sense. That is, if we move towards, for example, a system where we liberalize migration restrictions, obviously people will reshuffle across the economic geography. That'll have a static effect, but it will, of course, also influence the entire dynamic path of that spatial economy as we move forward. And so, more specifically, the type of exercise we're going to be doing in this paper is the following. We're going to take the world economy. We will split up this world economy into 64,800 grid cells of 1 degree by 1 degree. We will then take today's distribution of population, productivity, and amenities across all these cells, and then we will look at how trade, innovation, and migration affects this economy, this world economy, as we move forward. Right? And so the types of things we will be able to look at are the following. We'll be able to say how different areas of the world will fare moving forward into the future. We will also be able to say something about how that depends on how freely mobile people are across space. And not only will we be able to say something about how that affects the distribution of economic activity across all these different locations, but the model will also have implications on the aggregate economy. Right? So we are very interested in understanding the relation between space and the macroeconomy. So for example, depending on how freely mobile people are, that's again not only going to affect where people end up locating, it will not only affect how productive these different places are, but it's also going to affect the aggregate growth rate of the world economy. Right? And so that link between space and the macroeconomy is going to be of interest to what we do over here. Now, of course, once you have a theory of spatial growth, you can also use this theory to look at other questions. And so one of the applications we will have at the end of the paper, and I'm not sure I'm going to be able to get to that. I've been struggling actually to present this paper when I get an hour and a half, so now at 25 minutes it's going to be a little bit of a challenge. But you can look at different spatial shocks. So of course one of the interesting spatial shocks to look at are climate shocks. In this particular case, we will look at how coastal flooding will affect, again, this spatial distribution of economic activity, both in a static and a dynamic sense. Okay, so I'm going to start by very briefly giving you an intuition of the main elements of the model, and then I'm going to show you how we bring the model to the data, and lastly I'm going to show you some pictures of different types of exercises we do with this model. So again, very briefly, we are thinking here about an economy with a continuum of locations in two-dimensional space, right? So we're going to have longitude and latitude. Utility will depend on the consumption of a variety of goods, and it will also depend on a location's amenities. right? So if you live in a particular place, you will get utility from the amenities of the place where you live. The amenities will have an exogenous part. Think about the weather of a particular place. It will also have an endogenous part, which depend on how many people live there. Then in terms of mobility of people across space, we will look at different possible cases. In particular, I'm going to be focusing on two cases here in my talk. One where we're going to be keeping present-day migration restrictions constant over time. And when we say we're going to keep migration restrictions constant over time, we will interpret this as keeping relative utilities across countries constant over time. And then we will look at another extreme where we say, suppose that people are fully mobile, suppose there's no migration cost, suppose there's no migration barriers, so that utility in all periods equalizes across space. And we will compare how the economy fares in these two scenarios. In terms of technology, the production per unit of land of a farm will depend on labor, and it will depend on TFP. TFP is going to have two components. Phi will be an innovation decision, right? And so there's going to be some agglomeration economies coming through that, because you're going to pay a fixed cost in order to improve your productivity. If you can spread that fixed cost over more units of labor, that's going to be an agglomeration force. Then there's a second part to productivity, or to TFP, which we call Z. Z is going to be a realization of a random draw from a Fréchet distribution, as we've seen in some of the other papers today. And the average draw you're going to get will depend positively on how many people there are in the location. That's another agglomeration force. It'll depend on past productivity, it will depend on past innovation, and it will also depend on diffusion of technology from other places. The diffusion is important because otherwise you will tend to get over time you'll tend to get all activity concentrated in one point in space. Having it depend on previous technology is also important, because otherwise you would get stagnation over time. Okay, so these productivity draws are going to be IID across goods, but they will be correlated across space, and that correlation will go to 1 as distance between locations goes to 0. And as a result, what we will have is that in any given interval, any given small interval, we're going to have a continuum of firms competing in prices. These firms will innovate to the extent that the profits generated by innovation allow them to bid a higher land price. And so in this model, all the profits you make will actually get capitalized in the land price. Then very important, the dynamic profit maximization problem over here will simplify to a sequence of static problems because of the diffusion, right? So if you innovate in a particular place, that innovation will diffuse to all potential entrants by the next period, and so the firm's problem actually becomes a static problem. This is a key assumption in order to make this model tractable. Okay, so this assumption, together with the fact that firms compete in prices, allows us to apply some of the insights of the Eaton-Kortum model that others have talked about as well today. And what this will then allow us to do is we'll be able to come up with some simple condition for an equilibrium to exist and to be unique. Okay, and so I don't want to dwell too much on the model here, because I know time is short. But basically, what is this intuition for uniqueness of the equilibrium? Well, essentially, what you want is you want the agglomeration forces not to be too strong compared to the congestion effects. And the congestion comes from two parts. The congestion comes from land and also comes from amenities. Okay, and then the agglomeration forces come from the fact that innovating is more beneficial in more dense locations, and from the fact that on average you get a better draw from the fresh air distribution if you are in a more dense location. So we have existence and uniqueness. Then there is a second condition which is very similar. It just has one extra term over here, which allows us to specify when this dynamic system, this dynamic spatial system, converges to a unique balanced growth path. So what happens in a balanced growth path is that all these locations in the world grow at the same rate, and the distribution, the relative distribution of population across all these places stays constant over time. This
one clarification.
Yes.
So I didn't got this, but without mobility, is there factor price equalization?
There is no factor price equalization because there's amenities in this model, right? So if you have complete mobility and you wouldn't have any amenities in the model, then real income, not nominal, but real wages would equalize across space. Given that you have amenities in the system, you don't have equalization of real income, even if you have full mobility. Okay, so this is my balanced growth path condition, and then finally what we can define over here, and I think that's also an interesting thing, which relates again the spatial part and the macro part. You can come up with an expression that tells you how the growth rate in utility, which in the absence of amenities would be the same as the growth rate in real GDP, how that actually depends on the entire distribution of population across space. So once again, that's trying to tie what we see in terms of spatial distribution, how that relates to macroeconomic variables that we are interested in. So this is all I'm going to say about the model, but I think the two important points to make is that in spite of kind of the high complexity, right? I mean, we have a continuum of locations in 2 dimensions. We have trade, we have innovation, we have possible mobility of people or no mobility of people across space. This model is actually tractable and solvable. You know, we can define these different conditions to have uniqueness, to have a balanced growth path. And the nice thing is that in terms of solving it on the computer, this is actually very simple to do. It takes a long time because we have so many cells, but you can solve this model by simple iteration. So you don't need any kind of sophisticated or complicated numerical methods to do this. Okay, so now I'm going to move on. Yes.
Just another clarification: is population growing or is it stationary?
So in this particular, in the things I'm going to be showing you to you today, the population is not growing. But if you were to introduce population growth, then in the balanced growth path, the way you would think about it is that the relative share of population across locations would stay the same, but all these places would grow at the same rate in terms of population. But in what I'm going to be showing to you today, there's no increase in population. Okay, so for the calibration, I'm going to skip pretty much everything except a couple of things which are important to mention. So, of course, a bunch of parameters here which partly we take from the literature, partly we estimate ourselves, but I'm going to skip some things here and tell you something about amenities and utility and productivity. So how does this model work? In period 1, we have the distribution of land, population, and wages across all these cells, which we get from GEcon. We also have a bilateral matrix that tells you the transportation costs between any given 2 points in space. And from that, what we can actually back out is the productivity of each location. And then we can back out, and this is very important, we can back out the ratio of amenities to utility. Okay? And so what's important over here is that we cannot back out from the model amenities separately from utility. Now, in the case where you think that you're going to keep utility differences constant across time, when you solve this model forward, this is not an issue. But for example, if you want to look at other cases where you want to equalize utility across space because you have full mobility, then you kind of need to disentangle these two things. Why in the standard urban model do people not worry about this thing, or why doesn't this problem come up? Well, in the standard rollback model, what people assume is that utility is constant across space, right? If utility is constant across space, and then I see a low wage area with lots of people, then I just back out a high amenity, right? But once you have mobility restrictions, and we've seen that in the paper on Indonesia earlier today, once you have mobility restrictions, then you can't really make that claim anymore. You can't just say utility is the same across space and we're going to back out the amenities. And so the example I give is the example of Congo. Congo has a relatively high density, right? So either that would mean that it has great amenities or it has low utility, right? Because people are stuck there and they can't move. And so somehow we need to be able to disentangle amenities from utility. The way we're going to do this, this in our paper is we're going to be using data on subjective well-being to capture utility. Two things about subjective well-being. One is that this is not the question about happiness. Okay, when people say, "Are you feeling happy today?" we know that that's uncorrelated with anything really interesting. Whereas if you tell people, how satisfied are you with your life, comparing, 1 is the worst possible life you can imagine for yourself, and 10 is the best possible life you can imagine for yourself. Well, that measure of subjective well-being, as Deaton and others have shown, is very correlated with income. And that relation is very stable, whether you look across countries, whether you look across counties within countries, whether you look across individuals within metropolitan areas, etc. It's a very stable relation. And so we are going to use that relation. We're going to adjust it to the functional form we have in our model to actually come up with a measure, with a cardinal measure of utility. Now, just to sort of reassure you about this method, this of course will then allow us to disentangle A from U, okay? And then what we will do is we will take out the estimated amenities across all these grid cells, and we're going to correlate it with a bunch of variables which people normally think are good measures of amenities, such as temperature and precipitation, and the variance of the temperature and the variance of the precipitation, and whether you're close to water or close to a mountain. And essentially we will find all the right signs and everything will be statistically significant. So we think that this methodology, there may be other ways of doing it. In fact, the paper this morning suggested another way of doing this. We're happy to try to do this in different ways, but this is the way we've done it over here. But this is important. Okay, so and then, as I said, a second point before I show you the pictures is how do we actually think about these migratory restrictions? As I said, we're going to be looking at two cases, right? One case is keeping migratory restrictions constant over time, and we will interpret that as being the same as keeping relative utilities across countries constant over time. And then the second case will be we will liberalize migration completely. We'll assume that there's no cost to moving, in which case utility will equalize across space, and we will look at how the world behaves differently under these two scenarios. Okay, so this is our benchmark calibration. These are the fundamental productivities. These are what we call the fundamental utilities. More red means better. More blue means worse. So you can look at the productivity here. You can look at the amenities. As I said, we take these fundamental amenities, we correlate them with temperature and precipitation and etc. And the type of correlations we get are consistent with what you would expect. Okay, and so let me now talk about the two exercises. The first one is looking in a world where migratory restrictions are constant over time. This is period 1. You can think of this as being the year 2000 because those are the data we're using. It shows you density, productivity, amenities, and real income. A first very important observation is that if you compare population density with productivity or with real income, what you see is that there's actually some highly dense areas which are very productive, but there's also some very highly dense areas which are not productive at all, right? And so, for example, if you look at some places in sub-Saharan Africa, they have high density of people, but they have low productivity or low real income per capita. In fact, the correlation, if you do this at the grid cell level of 1 degree by 1 degree, the correlation between density and real income, for example, is minus 0.4 in the world. Okay, and so this is an important observation because what's going to be happening over time in this model is the following. The correlation between productivity and density, which is negative initially, is going to become less and less negative and is going to become positive. So what is driving that? In our model, having higher density will make places more productive over time because of agglomeration economies, and as they become more productive over time, they'll attract more people, and so there's some virtuous circle that will push the world into the direction of increasing the correlation between productivity and density over time. And I'm now going to show you some numbers that are consistent with that. But if you take that as given, well, then in a world in which we keep these migration restrictions constant, what we will see happening over time is a productivity reversal, right? So the high density places over time are going to become the high productivity places. And so if we now fast forward to period 600, you'll say, why do you want to look at period 600? This is like the year 2600. If you don't, there's two reasons. One is that it takes about 600 years for this model to reach a balanced growth path. If you don't want to look at 600, on our web page we actually have a movie, okay? And so you can click. You want to know 2050, you click, you stop, and you can see what happens, okay? But in any case, you see that the high density places of the before become the high productivity places of tomorrow. And what happens in places like the US and Western Europe, these places become high amenity places. There's a few people there, but these few people can enjoy the beautiful mountains and they're just happily sitting there, but they're not very productive. Okay? And so it's kind of the story of what some people may have in mind for China. Right? So the idea that the high density of China over time will inevitably lead to higher productivity. Okay, and so as I said before, these correlations which are negative in the beginning between, say, real GDP per capita and population density increase over time. Okay, and so let me just show you one number here. So this relation, so the model predicts that the relation between population density and real income is going to go from negative to positive as places become richer. Okay, and I'm not going to bore you with all the correlations here, but maybe this one here is interesting. You look in Africa, if you do this across the cells of Africa, you get a correlation of minus 0.04. Then this is ordered. Right, Asia is a little bit higher, Latin America is higher, Europe is higher, Western Europe is even higher, and then North America is even higher, and then Australia and New Zealand are the champions. Okay, so this correlation between population density and income is increasing over time, and you find the same result when you look within zip codes in the U.S. But I'm not going to bore you with that. Okay, so that's the first exercise. The second exercise, do I have 5 minutes about? I think? 7. Okay. So the second exercise is looking at the same picture, but now allowing for free mobility. So what we do here is that in period 1, we let everybody move wherever they want to so that utility equalizes across space, and then we move this economy forward, and in every time period utility equalizes across space. What do you see happening here? Well, not surprisingly, this is in period 1. The population density, which was high in sub-Saharan Africa and some areas in South Asia, well, that population density now goes down because of a lot of the people over here actually move either to Western Europe or to the US or to places in South America that have high amenities, right? So these places get more populated. And then, of course, as you move forward, that productivity reversal that you saw before doesn't happen anymore, right? Simply because now the high density places starting in period 1 are actually either the high productivity or the high amenity places. Okay? And so if you move forward and you look, for example, at productivity, this is how it looks like in the year 2600. So you don't see the productivity reversal anymore. It doesn't mean everything, it doesn't mean nothing changes, right? Some of the high amenity places in South America, for example, become highly productive. Now, in terms of the macroeconomy, there's some interesting things to report here as well. So if I, for example, compare, this is a table where the first line is no mobility or keeping mobility restrictions constant. The last line is free mobility. If I look at how discounted real income and discounted utility change if you liberalize migration, you see very big effects, right? So the effect on real income is about 70%, right? So liberalizing has a 70% increase in discounted real income. On discounted utility, it's even much higher, right? It's 312%. So here's something interesting happening. So a couple of things. One is that liberalizing migration increases the balanced growth rate quite substantially, right? Secondly, what you see happening here is a pretty big difference between utility and real income. And so what's actually happening here is the following. By liberalizing migration, not only are you improving things by moving people to more productive places, you're also improving things by moving people to higher amenity places. So think about if I were to be the planner. I mean, I can't solve the planner's problem here, but if I were to be the planner, and I know that in the very long run, population density and productivity are going to become very highly correlated, then ideally I would want that high population density to be in the places that have high amenities. So ideally you want to concentrate people in places which are nice to live, and because there's lots of people there, eventually they'll become very productive. Right? And so this is why you get this big effect, or this big difference between income and between and utility. So I don't have time to really go into the question of the rise in sea level, but let me just tell you what this type of model can do that others are not able to do. If you look at the existing literature on the increase in sea level, they do two types of exercises. One type of exercise is just to do a simple accounting exercise, and you say, oh, you know, if the sea level goes up by 1 meter or by 6 meters, let me see what gets flooded, and let me tell you, 9% of the population will get flooded, 10% of the structures will lose 15% of GDP. But it's done in a static sense, doing as if the distribution of population and GDP, etc., is going to stay the same forever, which is in some sense a little bit naive. A second type of exercise that people have done is saying, well, let me think about different scenarios. So what if in the next 100 years the poor countries of the world converge with the rich countries? How would that change things? But these are very kind of ad hoc exercises which don't really endogenize anything. So what we can do here is we can kind of look at what happens if sea levels rise, say, 100 years from now or 200 years from now. Well, it will flood different percentages of population because people will have moved in these 100 or these 200 years. The second thing you can look at is, once again, this idea that if you flood people, well, they'll move somewhere else, right? But then when they move somewhere else, that's not going to just affect things on the day they move, but it's just going to put the economy on a different dynamic growth path. And that's the type of exercise that we can accomplish in this type of exercise.
And in your model, that is an effect on the amenities or also in the productivity?
So in the way we've done things for now is to simply say, if land gets flooded, then people can't live on that land anymore. That's all. Okay? That's what we're assuming. It's just like, it becomes water, and so people can't live there anymore. Okay? So I'm going to conclude just by saying that the objective of this exercise is to create or to develop a spatial dynamic growth model in two dimensions. And the 2 dimensions is kind of important. In much of my previous work, we've been looking at continuum of locations across a line. By going from a line to 2 dimensions, we can really connect this theoretical framework with the data, right? And the whole objective is to come up with a theory which is simple enough so that it's solvable, that it's computable, and that is at the same time realistic enough so that we can connect with real data. And in some sense, because all these spatial data are improving so rapidly, right? I mean, every year there's new data sets coming up. We hope that this is sort of a first step towards doing some macro economics with spatial micro foundations, and to do both theory and data work, and to use it to address some of the big policy questions, such as climate change or flooding or other issues like liberalizing migration. I mean, the big policy lesson, I guess, from our exercise here is that the potential welfare effects of liberalizing migration outstrip by orders of magnitude the types of effects that people have found from, for example, liberalizing trade. Right? And so I think that's, and I think in your paper you found also big numbers which are in line with the ones over here. Thank you.